Thank you for joining me today, John. It's lovely to have you here. It's always a pleasure.
My pleasure.
So, with this edition of Mayne TV Talk, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your journey into the arts and discuss a little bit about the upcoming show for the South Devon Impressions, art inspired by local landscapes. Can you tell me about your journey into the arts?
Yes, it started in probably in the 50s when I was given a set of paints. I think I was about 7 years old, maybe a bit older, by my grandfather, who was a painter, and a very good painter. It wasn't his sole profession, but he painted scenes of the Downs of Sussex and the town of Lewes, and he got me painting buildings. So I was painting sort of mainly pubs, to be honest, because there was a chance that this painting might end up in a pub.
Nice.
And several of them did. And he gave me sort of not gentle guidance. He was quite reluctant to actually say anything about how to paint. He didn't want to inhibit me at all. And then from that, I just carried on doing it. But the first painting I remember doing was the coronation when I was 8.
Oh, yeah.
And my father bought me a roll of wallpaper to cut up to paint on the back of.
Yeah.
So I painted the coronation procession on a roll of wallpaper that was 8 feet long, with all the horses, the Queen, the carriages.
Aged 8.
Aged 8. And I thought it was terrific. It might have been quite poor, I don't know. And it was, I'd never been able to find it, so it can't have been that good. And then I was commissioned to paint a picture, the oddest picture I've ever painted, of the horse Nicholas Silver winning the Grand National in probably 1960, clearing the last jump. So that was an 8-foot high painting.
Oh, wow. And that was your first commission?
That was my first commission, and it was an oil painting.
At 8 feet high. How old were you then?
14.
14.
Yeah.
So are there any artists or movements that have influenced your style or your approach to painting and to art in general?
It's difficult to know what influence is. I think the first artist I noticed was Constable. And I'd been aware all through my childhood of paintings of the old masters that all seemed very brown and depressing.
Yeah.
And Constable's work looked so fresh by comparison. Even his highly finished work was just so real and fresh and typical English countryside scenes. And after that, my influences have been very odd, really. For instance, I really love the work of Francis Bacon. And some years later, we're talking about now the late 80s, went to the Tate Gallery and saw his exhibition. The strangest thing happened there. As we went in, I was on my way to my then art dealer in Mayfair with some paintings. And they wouldn't let us in because we were told that works of art aren't allowed in the Tate Gallery.
Interesting.
I was going to deliver them to my dealer afterwards.
Oh.
And so my wife had to sit on the steps while I went in. But I'm quite glad she didn't come in. It was like a butcher shop in there. It was just...
In what sense?
So gory.
Yeah.
Francis Bacon. But he did influence me. It made me think and look at things differently.
In what sort of way? I mean, you say he influenced you. What do you think you took from viewing that exhibition?
Just the honesty of what he was doing, just the truth. I think my grandfather tried to tell me to use my eyes and not my brain, not to rationalise about things, not to try and make points about things, but just to paint exactly what I see, which is the impressionist typically impressionist way of doing things. He didn't know that at the time, I'm sure. But so anything that makes me, anything, however unconnected with what I do, that makes me feel that's good because it is spontaneous and real and honest and so on, has an influence on what I do.
Yeah.
And that's how I measure my work. If it's too manipulative,
yeah, I see what you're saying.
I abandon it.
I remember actually the last time we had a chat and you talked about this painting you were doing. I think it might have even been of a pub in Lewes or a building, and you were painting the downpipe. And your grandfather had said to you, "Why have you painted that?" And you know, because I know there's a downpipe there, but you can't see it.
Exactly that. It's exactly what he said. Yes. So, so I had a lot of help from him, and I sort of drifted in and out of painting because even in my teens, music was a sort of competing passion, really.
Yeah.
And so I tended to have 5-year periods of painting and then 5 years of music and so on. And I've tried to combine them lately, but it's not easy. So, yeah, I suppose the big turning point was because I was exhibiting here in 1983.
Yeah.
And somebody said, I can't remember who it was, but somebody said, "You'll never know how good you are until you try to sell in London." So I can't believe the cheek I had. I just filled a case with paintings and took them up to the 4th floor of Harrods. I was thinking I'd be thrown out. And Mr. Peters, the chief of the art department, looked at them and said, "Yes, I'll take those."
From that point onwards, obviously selling in London, having gone from Devon, Dartmouth area, up to the big city, how did you find that part of your journey from that point forward?
Well, just going back beyond my entry into London, we had scoured the south coast for galleries that would take my work, and a few did, but I thought I'd absolutely achieved. I could say the impossible, but certainly some sort of notoriety by selling in Harrods. But then when I found a dealer in London that would take my work in Mayfair, and that led to a 25-year relationship with 15 or more one-man shows and so on, and he sold my work all over the world. He told me, "I'd really rather you weren't selling in Harrods." He described it as a supermarket. So I had to withdraw them from Harrods. And then at the end of that period of 25 or 26 years, takes us to about 2008, and I rejoined your gallery.
Yeah, that's interesting because we came here in 96. Would have been 4 years old.
Really?
Yeah. It's been an absolute joy to work with you. We've had some great shows, and
we have.
You know, that beautiful book that we published, and a brilliant show last year. So it's lovely again to have you here for this summer show.
Well, it's good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to chat with you. And in terms of, it's been a very varied career, as you said, with your music competing with your art. Do you find it, is there a chance of you being able to interweave the two, or do you find it's all or nothing with one or the other?
It used to be a bit all or nothing, but I remember when my wife and I were first together, we were in a bedsit in Chichester, in a lovely old house. And we had a huge room. And I was buying big rolls of paper and painting. So what I was doing was putting on a record, any record that I loved, like a Bach Brandenburg Concerto or Bartok's Concerto for Orchestra or the Modern Jazz Quartet or Jimi Hendrix, very broad musical taste, and paint abstractly exactly what the sounds I was hearing made me want to do on these huge bits of paper. And then we pinned them up all around the frieze of the high-ceilinged room. And that was as I say, that was probably about 1970. And then I got really deeply into music and had several bands and some in the 70s, and then came here in 75 into Devon and joined Mayne Gallery shortly after that. And well, I think the connection between music and painting sort of died a death in that period. But then recently I've been playing painting very abstractly to music again.
Yeah.
And I've done 3 or 4 of those, and I think I've got that out of my system for a while, so I can get back to proper work.
I mean,
I'm very easily
it's
distracted.
all part of it, isn't it? Because you are such a creative mind, and you have these different things that inspire you. I think it's I think it's fascinating weaving the music into the art.
It is.
And it's a whole different approach, isn't it? It's a completely different way of coming at the work. I mean, a lot of artists listen to music as they paint, but playing music, creating, is that act of creation.
Yeah.
And sometimes you need to go completely off in another direction in order to come back and feel re-inspired.
Yes, I'm sure that's true. Yeah.
What other creatives inspire you?
Well, I've mentioned Francis Bacon, which is a bit extreme. There was a painter in America who died recently called Richard Schmidt, who wrote a book, which was a sort of tutorial book, really. But he really inspired me to paint oil paintings in a different way. That happened in my first years back here in the early 70s. No, the mid 70s. 75, I came back from London area. And it was just the freedom of his brushwork and the way he prepared his surfaces with, I mean, for instance, this is the thing, I think one needs to have limitations on your ability so that it doesn't get too slick. For instance, he would prepare a surface really roughly with very random pits and troughs in the ground, and then so painting on that, you couldn't make the marks that are so intensely painted that they're perfect. Everything was, the brush skipped across peaks and troughs in the canvas, and so he was a great influence, and he was probably the best American figurative painter ever, and he's much loved, and there's a YouTube channel about him and so on. Other people that have influenced me, there are a number of Spanish artists that my dealer in London used to have. But the Spanish are great painters. The contemporary Spanish art is absolutely astonishing. The French, not so much so. And I love France and worked in France for years. But there was one, I went into the gallery in London one day, and on the left of the doorway as I walked in was a large oil painting of a scene in south of France. And I asked Mr. O'Mell, as I called him then, who painted it. He told me it was a Gabriel Deschamps. And I said, where does he paint? He said, oh, down near Grasse, just north of Nice. And that completely changed my life, that sentence, because I'd been to Italy before and painted in Italy. I'd never been to France. And so I think it was in June 1988, we drove some pretty unsound advice by a friend. It's great fun if you're making a journey through a country, to draw a straight line from where you're going to land in the country to where you want to go.
Oh yeah.
And that was a diagonal line from from the Roscoff ferry
Mm-hmm.
to Provence, and it took us 6 days. And we, because the French only signpost Paris, so they don't put signs for anywhere else. And but we really got to know the country quickly in that way. And I went and found all the places where Gabriel, who still was painting then, never found him.
No.
I wanted to, but I didn't. And that just got me. And then I would say 80%, if not more, of the work I sold with Hermel Galleries over all those years was French.
Mm.
And I still do. I've got in my head, I've got a lot of paintings yet to paint.
Yes, yet to be painted.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's been a really incredibly varied career for you. Devon, London, France, Spain, Italy. What would you say would have been, one of your main highlights of your career as a painter?
I think the one moment was achieving a one-man show in Aix-en-Provence in 1992, which unfortunately I timed when we crashed out of the RM, and we couldn't draw money from the bank, and I thought nobody's going to buy anything at the moment. But Aix is a beautiful city, and we had such a great time, and a lot of friends came to support me, mostly musicians, and we hired rooms in different hotels. And I remember one girlfriend of one of the band members said on the first night, at the end of the first evening, I have now spent all the money already that I brought for the whole trip. So we had such a good time, and the French were so lovely about the paintings.
Yeah.
That I've got a book of things they've written, about the paintings that are so touching and insightful and wonderful. And sold quite a few of them, but the main thing was the event, the thing itself. It was lovely. So that's my most memorable moment, really.
Well, I've never been to Aix-en-Provence, unfortunately, but so maybe we'll have to pop up there.
Yeah, why not?
At some point.
Yeah.
Be nice to dust off my French skills.
Yeah. Oh, it is lovely.
Yeah.
Well worth a visit.
So have you collaborated with any other artists in any way?
Yes. I think the only real collaboration was in 1988. There was a group of artists in Dartmouth who, I think they called themselves the Dartmouth Four. And I had a call from the wife of one of them, the wife of Andras Kaldor, Sally Kaldor, and she said, we want you to join our group. And I said, I'm not really a group joiner, but she pressed it, and she rang several times. And she said, look, it's not an intellectual group, it's more of a drinking group, really. So I went along, and that was really the reason that we bought our place, along with two of the members of the group in Limoux, which we had for 20 years, my studio there. So, but the meetings we had were great, and art was hardly mentioned. There was certainly no kind of philosophical discussion about the purpose of art. It was just the problems of being an artist.
Okay.
And we had several shows. We had a show in Leamington and several in Dartmouth and one somewhere else. I can't remember where. But that was fun. But it kind of fizzled out after a few years. Okay. We still know each other, but I think it had its day. So.
Well, we all go through those different stages, don't we, in our life? We come to these threshold moments where you kind of step from one phase to the next, and some things fall away and some things stick.
Yeah.
And that sort of leads me on to my next question, really, about Is there anything that's really been a common thread throughout your work? I mean, there's many things, I'm sure, but causes or movements that have a thread running through in terms of the expression of your artwork, or something that inspires you in some way that's key to your painting?
Yes. I haven't known it, but it's just recently occurred to me what it is. And it started embryonically, I think, quite a way back, but I can't really tell you when. And it's now apparent to me because it's reached its full flowering in what I want to do, which is nature.
Yeah.
And this isn't my job before becoming a full-time artist in 1975 was a landscape architect for a county council, and mainly dealing with roads and motorways, and not just planting trees, but how the roads would sit in the landscape, how the verges or the cuttings and embankments would be shaped so that it's good for the road user, but also good looking in from the outside. And so nature became, I mean, I know this is of no earthly use to me, but I know the Latin names of all native trees and shrubs.
Yeah.
It's using up the part of my brain I could do with. But it's becoming apparent to me now that some of these paintings that I'm doing right now don't have any kind of man-made element in them.
Yeah, I have noticed that.
And I think what we're learning now about how things happen in nature, especially locally, in the valley I live in, I'm on a river, a lovely river, little river, that feeds Slapton Lee. And I spend so long in that lagoon, walking around that lagoon. It's just astonishing. And it's becoming more and more important to me. And that's what I want to represent more than anything. I love man-made objects, good architecture, and towns and cities that are beautiful, but nature's something else. It's the way the plants talk to each other, the way things help each other under the ground, the things that happen in winter under the soil, beyond belief.
It's fascinating. I'm right there with you. I've always been interested in nature, and I think it's interesting because almost every single artist that I speak to, one of their biggest inspirations or influences is nature. And the thing is, we're not separate from it. It's where we come from and what we go back to. And like you say, how the trees communicate with each other through sugar releases and fungi and mycelium that live in the roots. And they help out other trees that aren't necessarily the same species. And
that's the wonderful thing. That's
so cool. I mean, absolutely. I'm a total nature geek. I love it.
And what I also love is that we hear that I think it's holly trees that will help oak trees if they're in distress by the root systems. But there's a place, a field near me, where there are two trees, and I can't remember what they are. One's an oak, and the other's not an ash, but it's another native species, and they're elderly trees, and they actually have their backs to each other. They hate each other. They grow out and away from each other in the landscape, and they're the only trees in that field. It's so funny.
Maybe they're counterbalancing. Maybe they're reaching out further that way to get more nutrients from each side, and under the ground they're intertwined. Who knows?
Well, that's a nice light to shine on it. I think they just don't like each other.
Yeah. But there's also that interesting myth, isn't there? There's really great mythology around the green man, and there's this feud, isn't there, between the holly tree and the oak tree in mythology, that in the winter the holly tree, the evergreen, becomes stronger and more powerful, and then in the summer the oak tree is victorious and strong and the victor, if you like, between that battle between the holly tree and the oak tree. And I think that's fascinating.
When we moved to our house in near Black Alton, I must have planted enough trees for an acre and a half of land in that smallish plot, and now they're giant, and they're all fighting for light and going up and up and up. And every now and then one of them gives up and crashes over.
But you know, deadwood as well is a whole new environment for all these different species. And in death and decay, there's so much food for other species, and fungi, and all these sort of things. So
I was so proud because the first oak tree that fell over on our boundary into the garden, we cut a few logs off it. We left the main thing there, and about 5 years later, my daughter and I were looking at the tree and poking around at it, and there was a stag beetle in it.
Yeah,
that's something else.
Very cool.
And also in our house, which I'm sad about because our house had been empty for 7 years when we moved in. At the back of the house were glowworms.
Wow.
Glowworms, but they really don't like civilization.
People.
So they're not there now.
No, they've probably gone off and they're probably living around the trees that you planted or something.
Yes.
I suppose to finish off, is there anything that you'd really like your collectors to know about you, or something that would maybe surprise them, or
gosh,
a fun fact, let's say?
At 14, I was the youngest organist and choir master of the church in Britain, according to the Daily Express.
That is a fun fact. I love that. Well, thank you, John.
I wasn't any good.
No, is that? No, I'm sure that's not true. I've heard you play organ. You're very good. Well, it's, as always, a real pleasure to chat with you. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you.
And
very nice.
Yeah, I look forward to unveiling your amazing paintings at the show. It's
so
going to be
smashing.
Very exciting.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mm-hmm.